Why, hello, Scott. How are you? Hello, Scott. Hi. Two of my favorite people.
Hello.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, Bill.
Happy Tuesday.
Yeah. Okay. Who's that? Is that Jacqueline and Scott?
Yes, they're flying back from Abu Dhabi. So
Oh my God.
I'll be hosting. They're trying to set it up because there's a new security issue on Zoom.
Oh, you mean doesn't allow what flights from Abu Dhabi?
For some reason, they have one of those things where it checks with another computer.
Oh, I see. I see.
So Scott, if you can send the host over here, or you'll just be able to join. That's great.
Do you think he can hear you?
Unclear.
Hey, Elena.
Wave. So
Hey,
they
Mark,
never
how are
hit.
you today?
Oh, I'm okay.
Don't know if you mentioned this before or not. Did you read this yet?
I've read parts of it. Yes.
It's an interesting writing companion.
Yeah. What do you think?
It's interesting in that I find it rather than being a how-to instructive type of book, which you might expect it to be,
Yeah, it's very zen.
more spiritual. Yeah, it is.
Very zen.
It is.
You know, I don't know if I mentioned this. I spent a couple days with Rick about 8 years ago.
Did you?
Well, he had really admired the Twyla Tharp book, so he called me up and wanted to talk to me about writing what became that book.
Mhm.
And so I flew out to Malibu and spent 2 days with him in the recording studio where he was recording Ruining the Career of Jake Bugg, and because he hasn't been heard of since. And he was telling me all these great stories about Jay-Z and Tom Petty and Johnny Cash and Neil Diamond and every time I'd say, we got to use that in the book, and he says no. And you will see that there is like one anecdote in the book.
Yeah.
And he has gone through two. Anyway, I said I can't do this. It didn't end pretty, but
Oh.
he got really mad at me. But he stuck to his guns, and so it's gone. I think he wrote a whole book 4 years ago. He had a deal with another publisher, and then he scrapped it. He just wasn't happy with it. And he said this in interviews recently, and then he got Neil Strauss, who's a really terrific writer, most infamous for writing a book called The Game.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And which is about how to pick up girls and be a player. And he's done a terrific job, I think. I didn't read the whole thing. It was just a little too much fuzzy. But
he did a cool podcast with Dan Carlin. I'll send it to you.
Yeah.
Where he talks about the getting to the point of this book. And
yes. I listened to a really long one he did with Joe Rogan. It was 3 hours, and it was great. And it wasn't, and only about a third of it was about the book, and another third was about professional wrestling, and another third was about comedy. There was very little, and then 1/3 was about Rick's career as a music producer. But anyway,
yeah, he's got an interesting.
And the book's a big success. I'm surprised, not shocked, but pleased for him. He needs the money, and
what?
No. No, he's got many hundreds of millions of dollars.
Exactly.
Anyway. So it's not exactly a sore subject with me, but I don't
Sorry, I
think.
brought it up. I didn't mean
No,
to.
no, it's not. It would never have worked out. It's not like that's one that got away. I don't look at it that way. I
Mhm.
had a good time with him.
Well, seems like an interesting guy with a lot of intellectual, seemingly disparate intellectual interests.
Oh yeah, he's got range.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
a lot of range, and he's got a wide swath of friends. So, you know, when his trainer is like Laird Hamilton, the great surfer,
Yeah.
an incredibly fit guy. He's got he's got access to a lot of cool people.
Well, he lives an interesting life. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, we spent some time at his house in a bariatric chamber where he goes into heal. That was weird. It was an odd house, no furniture in it. But it was, and then his studio, Shangri-La, is like about 1.5 miles away. So you have to drive to the studio. And he has a whole staff of people, and there was a whole choir recording in one section of the house in one of the studios, and he would never go in. He would just let one of his assistants handle the whole thing. He does a lot by remote control, you know. Very impressive operation.
Well, as I said, I'll look up that Carlin podcast and send it to you. Carlin does a history podcast, and they go everywhere but history. This conversation is just.
No, he's good. He's a good talker. Real good.
Yeah, but he speaks a fair amount about the book and the process and kind of what he went through to trying to birth this. So
yes. No, it's been. He's had a couple of miscarriages along the way. Yeah. But he got through it. You know what? Obviously, Rick Rubin knows how to get things done. So
he had a vision for what he was trying to produce, and I think he struggled trying to figure out exactly what that was.
Right. I think his big struggle was finding the right collaborator, and he did find one. Anyway.
Well, thanks for that.
Hello, everyone. Shall we get started?
Yeah, that's
Good morning,
about
Mark.
a 5-minute rolling start. So
Okay. The I'm going to apologize for my voice. I'm recovering from a respiratory infection. It's been about 3 weeks now. If I talk too much, I will just have a coughing jag here on the call. So I'm going to count on you guys to talk, but just some prefatory remarks. The subject at hand is we were supposed to read this.
Yeah.
Secret. The reason, not for a couple of reasons. One, I was a collaborator on it, so I know it intimately well. And 2, it's short. 3, it has a sexy subject, and it's kind of easy to understand. But the principal reason is that I think it is a good example. Well, it's a memoir, and memoirs, well done, by definition, are good examples of how to tell an anecdote or how to relate an anecdote, how to introduce one, how to execute the telling of it, and how to get out and, how to get out of it as quickly as possible so it does its job. And then you figure out what its job is. And so since we're reading books for the craft of how they're done rather than the content, we could explore some of the ways that anecdotes in Once Upon a Secret get the job done. And it's and I also suggested, really for extra credit, I don't expect anybody to read it, but also to take a look at Writing About Your Life by Bill Zinsser, which is an excellent example of something that is sort of a memoir, but not really. but it's writing about memoirs. And the most interesting thing in this book is, that's unfair. There are many interesting things in the book, but the one that's most interesting to me for this purpose, for our purposes today, is he at some point, Zinzer writes that people say to him, "You've led an interesting life. You should write a memoir." And Zinzer points out that that an interesting life doesn't necessarily make an interesting memoir, because so much of life is routine and drudgery and just getting to work and sitting at it. And for a writer, sitting at a desk and doing the work, which isn't much fun to watch or explain. But what makes a memoir interesting, he said, let's see if I got the quote correctly, only small pieces of a life make an interesting memoir. And that's and when I read that, it kind of made me think that that's what's going on in Once Upon a Secret. It's really a wisp of a story that you have this 19-year-old girl who goes on for 2 summers and little extracurricular moments of having an affair with the president, and then he dies. She keeps it a secret, and she has to live the rest of her life with a secret. And what is the aftershock and aftermath and repercussions of keeping a secret? Well, that's not much of a story to hang a book on. It's got a lot going for it, that when I heard about it, made it immediately attractive to me as a book agent. I said, I can sell that for a lot of money. So, for the obvious reasons. You got the JFK name, which, if it's either him or Lincoln who are the most documented presidents, and probably, so, but people never tire of more books on them, and it's about sex, something illicit going on. And the third best thing was Mimi, to me, was as the author, was a very appealing character, because she is inoculated from the obvious criticism. Oh, you're just jumping on the bandwagon of women who've had an affair with the president. But no, she kept it a secret. She was outed by the media, so she's kind of going into this unwillingly but bravely. And once you have that combination, those circumstances, the commercial appeal of the book is kind of dramatically improved. Even though the story itself, young girl having an affair with an older man, is as hoary as it gets, Hoary. And but even within that wisp of a story, you have the opportunity. You got to go find the little anecdotal points to keep the narrative moving. And God bless her, Mimi had them. She was she remembered a lot of stuff, and it was my job to point out, yeah, that's a significant touch point. We gotta include that. And in going back, I hadn't read this in quite a while. In going back, I noticed it was incredible how we kept dotting. Every chapter had 1 or 2 or 3 anecdotes, and every chapter sort of had kind of an anchor scene that was pretty memorable, culminating. Whoops, sorry about that. Israel calling, and really great stuff. That the fact that Mimi was in the bedroom at the White House at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis is kind of, and I triple checked all this stuff with the the Kennedy Library has an amazing online site where they have the president's calendar in kind of like graphic form. So you could literally turn the page to his calendar for all 1,000 days of his presidency. And it has the logs from who was on the plane, the logs from everyone who went into his office. It was quite specific. And I could determine that she wasn't like misremembering or making anything up. And so I had to fact check my client basically. So the online resources of the Kennedy Library made this really, really easy to fact check and enhance with facts. And as I read this, reread my work, it just occurred to me that, God, we got a lot of information in here that I hadn't really recalled. Although during the process of writing it, you're constantly trying to, install as many facts as you can find into every piece, because that lends it veracity, credibility, and it just gives it texture. So those are my little prefatory comments before I lose my voice. And I'm wondering what anybody else's thoughts about this. Or first off, did you enjoy the book? Oh, good. Yeah. I'm looking at Amanda here, nodding her head. And you, Dean. And so why? Anybody have thoughts? Elena?
Yeah, what I found, while the story is sexy, that it illicit affair with the president who is, known to be a womanizer, et cetera. Well, that's all an interesting story. I found the work that you did around building who she was even more interesting. The making of somebody who achieves a certain social status or enjoys a certain social status, a certain life of privilege, et cetera. All of the things that you chronicled about that part of her life, I found particularly interesting because it made her into a real person, not just some girl that was going to intern at the White House and happened to stumble into the bed of the president. And I thought the stories that she told about her discomfort with some pieces of that world were also interesting. Having to do a debutante ball, 2 debutante balls, because her mother insisted she do New Jersey and New York, and not being somebody who had a lot of boyfriends at the time, and who was she going to take, and her brother embarrassing her by dancing with her, holding a $5 bill behind her back, hoping someone would take her off his hands, and going away to school and being in a house rather than a dorm. And the house just reminded her of the house she left and how terribly homesick she was, and, struggling with food and, not wanting to be that girl who came back 30 pounds heavier. Instead, she comes back 30 pounds lighter and is, emaciated, essentially, from trying not to fall into a trap that she thought others had fallen into, but was really struggling probably with extreme depression. Not just loneliness, but depression at that time. So it was just interesting to see you build her in many ways as a sympathetic character when she, compared to most of us, is so different. Her upbringing, her experiences are not common to the mass reader of a book like this. And I thought that was masterful.
Well, thank you. I gotta give a lot of credit to Mimi, who remembers all those details. That thing about the $5 bill and dancing with her brother. I mean, that she has a memory, and I should tell you this kind of the origin story of this is, and I may have mentioned it somewhere here before on one of these sessions, was her now husband, Dick Alford, her second husband, the one she married in the aftermath of getting outed, was a colleague of mine at IMG. And he retired, and in about 2010 or 11, he called me up and he said, Hi, Mark. I don't know. I haven't talked to you in a while. I got married, he said, and my wife is writing a book. And I go, hey, you know, and he says, here, let me put her on. And Mimi comes on. And hi, Mark, heard a lot about you. I'm writing a book. I go, what's it about? And she goes, I can't tell you. And well, how much have you written? She goes, about 150 pages, which is meaningless. I don't know how big the type is. Well, why don't you email it to me? And she goes, I don't want to do that. Okay. I go, well, why don't you FedEx it to me? And she goes, that I'll do. And so 2 days later, this manuscript comes in, and I have no idea what this is about, what her memoir is about. And I read the first 5 pages and I go, holy shit, this I can tell. And so so by the time, so I was the agent and I worked with her on the proposal, and we sold it to Random House for a 7-figure advance. And we had a writer who was a client of mine, who will go nameless, but let's call her Judith. And since that's her name, and a really terrific writer, very funny. And I thought the book was going to be about the prurience. I needed somebody who was willing to ask her all the questions about sex with the president, at least in my stupid mind. And Judith was that woman. And she was a very funny writer with a kind of a New York Jewish sense of humor. And she was all wrong. And she wrote 4 chapters of the book. And she sent them to Random House without showing them to me. And yeah. And our editor called me up and goes, we got a problem. Because she kind of wrote it like a Jackie Mason routine, and Mimi is anything but, a Borscht Belt comedian. And so
can you give us an example of what was so wrong about it?
That's that's a long time ago. It was just the subtleties of voice are kind of hard to explain, but it was just, first off, Mimi hated it. So that's, you don't need 10 reasons to fire someone. That's the first reason. That's the only reason you need. But it was just kind of all these like snarky asides that sounded kind of like New York sharp. That just wasn't her, She's a very sincere, thoughtful person. And so we fired her, and then we hired another woman to write it, a real pro who's also good nameless, and who had done many bestsellers, and also had the advantage of having gone to Mrs. Porter's, and graduated a year earlier than Mimi, and was good friends with Mimi's sister, who'd also gone to Mrs. Porter's. So there was a lot of synchronicity there. And she wrote a complete manuscript that was just dull. And contractually, we were obliged, Random House wouldn't accept it. And Mimi had paid each of those women already upfront $125,000. So she was in the hole $250,000 already. And so contractually, we had to give her notes, and she was allowed to take a second try. So she wrote a second manuscript. That was like, 5% different, but just as dull. And so now Mimi's on the hook for $250,000. And we got nothing. We're at zero again. So I volunteered to write for nothing. But for the percentage, we worked out a deal that was appealing to her and to me. And I got started on the book, and I realized that the thing that both these two writers, they didn't like Mimi. That was the big problem. They kind of had contempt for her. They saw her from the vantage point of 2012, you know. She won't admit that she was raped. She, you know, that sort of thing. And she's a ditz. That's what they thought of her, as a silly girl. And they were, I don't know why they were in it, for the money or what. But the fact that they didn't like her or respect her must have seeped into the way they told the story. That's my firm belief. And because they didn't like her, they wouldn't go the extra mile of asking her questions and bringing out all the stuff that she knew. You know, that $5 bill story was not in either version, Elena, you know, that sort of thing. So she and I had to, this is the part that my contribution to it was, I really liked her. She was a lot of fun. And I think I've said before, I take my time with this. Some people call it procrastinating, but we talk a lot. And so it happened to be that where she lived in Massachusetts in the Berkshires was only an hour away from my lake house upstate. So that's where we started meeting and just talking for, 4-hour sessions, and I could ask her anything. And so we restarted it, and the book wrote itself pretty fast. It didn't take that long to write it once we got all the interviews done.
Art, that you had a different way of seeing her because you're a man versus the other two. One woman lived her life, right? Went to Mrs. Porter's, et cetera, school, and had that background. So whatever judgments may have come along with that could have contributed to how she looked at Mimi. The other one maybe was just too lazy to invest in the relationship with her. I don't know what might have prompted her not to, but you write a sympathetic character from out of the anecdotes that you've pulled from her. Do you think for a man?
No, I don't think. No, I think it starts with I really liked her. And
you had compassion for her, Mark, or did you like her?
No, she's just fun.
Okay, it was no deep compassion for the character and her struggles. It was just you liked her and it was fun.
Yeah. So, and I respected her story.
Yeah, respect.
I wasn't judging her. As and plus I got to see how smart she was.
Yes. I'm judging her. That to me is.
Yeah, I remember one time. We started talking about percentages of this and this and this, and I misremembered my share of the money, and to my
do that. How can you possibly do that?
To my advantage, and she kind of said, no, that's not it, and she kind of like just rattled it off, and you think she's not paying attention. She's just whip smart, but I'd seen evidence of that all along, So that's where, so she and I had a lot of comfort with each other, and at one point, I spent a week when she was wintering down in West Palm Beach with her husband. They'd rented a house. I went down there for 10 days and just lived with them. We had dinner every night and, that sort of thing. And I don't think the other two writers were willing to do that. But, so it ain't the man part. It's that I'm willing to become them,
Yes.
or be as creative, as much affinity with them as I can. And I do that with all my clients.
Other women authors also.
Yes. Yeah. The gender thing isn't the issue.
Mark,
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because when I started reading the book, I haven't gotten that far. I started like 3 days ago, pretty much. But that was my comment, is I was expecting to don't like the story because it was an affair, of course, or having a lot of pity. And what I'm finding is I like it. I'm enjoying. This is fun. This is a person. Let me know more. So it's very interesting because probably that's the nature of all of us, to have a one way of understanding, some facts. So you're giving us different angle of the same facts. So that's kind of my comment, but I have a question about anecdotes. How much should we, or is ethic to add into anecdotes when you don't really remember a lot of the details? So not specifically for a memoir, but in general, right? So you can start inventing, oh, it was like $5, oh, it was 10. What if I put this? What if oh, now all of a sudden, so you're creating a story within the anecdote. And of course, the simple question is like, no, you don't that. You don't invent things. But I want to know what you think in general, right? How you create, revisit or revisit the memory or invent it. I don't know.
Well, there's in this case, because it involves an extremely well-documented historical figure, you really don't invent anything. And I didn't have to, because Mimi's memory was so good. And when it wasn't, well, I'll give you an example. There's a scene in there where she accompanies Kennedy made a very famous trip supporting the national parks to Yosemite in 62 or 63, I can't remember, maybe 63. And she went on the trip. And so I started at, well, what exactly? And she, as much as she could remember, what the logistical details of how you travel in the support plane, and she was on the log. I went to the files on that. And she kind of explains, and I go, well, where were you? She goes, well, I was in the same floor as the presidential suite, but I had to stay in my room while they had their big equivalent of a state dinner downstairs in the Iwani Lodge. And I go, well, why were you there? And she says, well, I was just there to wait. And then like, after dinner at 8 o'clock, somebody knocks on my door, walks me down to the presidential suite, and they knock on the door. The president opens the door, and that person goes away. I don't think it was Dave Powers. And I walk into the president's suite, and they're going to have sex. So well, how does this get started? And she's trying to think. And I was asking her all this up at our lake house one evening, and then she had to go home. And so she spent the evening when she went home with Dick trying to figure out plausibly, well, Dick, help me remember. So they spent a few hours on it. And then the next day she came back to my lake house, and we like figured it out, Well, his back hurts, and I get on the bed and I take off his shirt and all that stuff. And we get into the business of, warming up, the foreplay. And I'm sure, well, there's no one who can dispute it, but this is the best of her recollection, right? And this is the comfort I had with Mimi. There was like no barriers with us. And so we got a scene out of that. And it was the same thing with the first time in the White House, the rape scene. I go, where was it? She and I were like crawling all over each other, I realized, where we were trying to figure, well, how did he get this one piece dress off? And
Yeah.
I got a lot more information than what actually went in the book, but yeah. So so there's nothing really made up, but you are just struggling, or not struggling, but you're fighting to get as many details as you can, because that lends the verisimilitude to the scene, and the reader really appreciates that. And the other thing, one thing I want to say about anecdotes is almost all of them start with an action, where you're actually like doing something. My wife used to be an actress, and so she took acting classes. So I had to, and she would always hang around with all the other actors, and they would come to our apartment, and they would either talk about, well, they always talked about themselves, but a lot of times they would talk about what they were learning in class. And one of the things that always stood out to me was that whenever they would do a scene where there was dialogue or a conversation among 2 or 3 people, they would always have to be doing something. That's what their teachers were teaching them. It's not like they're telling someone about their plans. They're standing in front of a mirror and tying their tie, or and you see these now. I really notice this in movies where when characters are talking to each other, one or both characters are doing something, either dicing peppers or onions or something at the kitchen table, or something. They're always doing something, driving in a car. The one example I always think of is Brad Pitt. He's always eating something, always. Just count the number of things he eats in Ocean's 11, and you will stop at about 1,000. And now extrapolate that into entering a scene. You almost always have to have the character doing something, just to initiate the scene or the anecdote. So appreciate you ask about, did I make something up? Yes, I did. And it's at the beginning of chapter 4 or 5. Chapter 5, where Mimi has had her first encounter with the president up in the residence. So, and he calls her a car at the end of chapter 4, asks if she's okay. She says, I'm fine. And she goes down to the South Portico and gets in the car, the town car, which is going to take her to her apartment in Georgetown. And end of chapter 4. Beginning of chapter 5. This is the part, is just a little novelistic touch. I have to have her doing something rather than just sitting in the car, right? So she's sitting in the car, and this may or may not have happened. She may have suggested it or not. I can't remember. I think I made this up. I said, well, what if we have you turn around to look back through the rear window of the town car to look at the White House? It's late in the evening, the sun is setting, it's June, so it's maximum daylight. You got to research all this. All of this is plausible, and the lights are on in the second floor of the residence. And I have Mimi thinking, I was just there with the president. And all of a sudden, you're now in the car going to the apartment, and it gives you a chance for her to reflect on what has just happened. And, and she's wondering, she's trying to make sense out of the whole thing. And the only thing she can conclude is she's not a virgin anymore. And that's the scene. It goes on for, almost 2 pages. And then she's at the apartment and she takes a shower and, has to wake up the next morning. But it's that little action that instigates the scene, the turning around, which allows her to reflect on what has just happened. Other than that, she's just sitting in the car and thinking, you know. You have to have a way of triggering it.
Mark, I noticed so many places where you would have had to have been asking her questions. Well, what were you looking at? Well, what were you thinking? What was your main thought? It made me think there's no way you could write a memoir without a partner, because you just can't make yourself go through that whole questioning thing as easily as a curious person who's a friend who likes you asking questions. Why did you do that? What were you thinking? What was it like? What did you eat? What did you drink? Where were you walking? I mean, all of those questions, there was so much detail in there that added so much liveliness to the story, but I don't think she could have ever done that. Even if she was a fantastic writer, I don't think she could have plumbed the depths of her memory without a partner.
Mimi, yes, she couldn't because she's not a writer. But the thing about a memoir is you are master of your own story. If she had been a professional writer, I think she could do that, because there's a memoir written every hour, published every hour. It does help to have a partner, and a lot of times it's the editor. Once you hand in the first draft, it's the editor who says, tell me more here. What was going on here? And actually has very specific questions that elicit little pieces of information. But I take your point that getting all that detail in does require a kind of a prodding from someone. On the other hand, a really experienced writer will know what's missing, will read the paragraph and say, God, this is thin, and then start filling in the details. They'll know, and it'll come automatically, I think.
Mark?
Yes.
When we write, we often write about crucible moments of leaders, which can be pretty boring. The CEO does this at this moment, or in coaching, he had this revelation, or at 9/11, he did this. It's not as much fun. Okay. And so if you were to translate the magic of what you do with all of these amazing, this is an amazing emotive story. So what's your advice when we are writing a story about a client organization that we help change, or a CEO that helped change, and we want to make it narrative and interesting, because they're very boring. We don't want to write Fortune magazine stuff, right? We want to put the emotion and the action in there. You've done this a lot. What's your advice when we don't have sexy presidents? Okay. And he was a sexy president.
That's a very big question.
I always ask him big.
I will say this. That because it's hard to answer, but that you put your finger on the emotive part is important. Because when I collaborate with people, one of the first things I tell them is what we're going to try to do in this book that you're probably not used to or comfortable with is I want the reader to feel rather than feel before they think what's going on there.
Helpful.
Marshall is really good at that in his public speaking, at making people cry or making people feel an emotion. And so in writing his books, I had to get that. And I might have learned it from him, I don't really think I put it into the collaboration working with him. That never occurred to me, but I think that's true. The idea to make people feel something, because that's what he does in his public presentations. He
doesn't write about theory. He writes about people in
Yeah.
the stories.
No, I've seen him send people crying out of the room.
Yeah.
When he has them talk about their parents or something like that in a kind of a long session. So anyway, if you go into telling the story knowing that you want the reader to feel an emotion, whether it's happiness, sadness, pity, sympathy, joy, whatever. If you go into that, you can then, of course, you can then tell the story that way. Of course, this begs the question: how do you do that? And that's beyond the purview of this session. Because it's just a lot of effort. But I will go back to the idea of instigating the anecdote with a very specific action. It's like, I think the book the second chapter starts out with Mimi on a train. So if there were an anecdote going on there, you would say, I was riding the train, minding my own business, reading page 92 of Finnegan's Wake for the 10th time because I don't understand it. And okay, so you've given them a lot of specific facts right there, right? You're on a train, minding your own business, reading James Joyce's most difficult book and not understanding it. When someone tapped me on the shoulder, right? And then all of a sudden the scene begins.
Doris Kearns Goodwin had a similar experience with the president. Because I used to bring her in to speak all the time, because guys like listening to Doris Kearns Goodwin in business. And she has a story about President Johnson trying to seduce her. And she's very specific. She writes about it was a picnic, there was a blanket, the color of the blanket, this and that. But she is a modern hero, escapes, right?
Right. Yeah. So see, and there's tension and everything in that.
Yeah, exactly. Is she gonna? They're in the
I
garden or something.
remember the ones where he's on the toilet and he's talking to her. There's lots of those apparently.
I know. Yeah.
So Mark, I have a couple questions.
But again,
What
it begins with an sorry, Dean. Again, begins
Right.
with an action. Johnson on the toilet.
Yeah.
Well, that's one of Zensner's, show, don't tell.
Yes.
Don't tell them what they did, tell them how they felt.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so anytime I read a book that I know you were involved with, I can't help myself but to look for Easter eggs, right? And these little Markisms. And so just over the year of you doing this class with us, of looking at the first sentence and looking at the last sentence, and then looking for these themes of the anecdotes. So everyone has a secret, right? And this is mine. As I've gotten to know you, I know you love people's secrets. You're so good at getting us to tell our secrets. But there were some things that I thought was, I didn't know why you chose what you chose. And so even in the first chapter, you kept using the word as usual, so she hung up her jacket at 9 as usual. And then she did this as usual. And this was the routine. But then there's all the president's routine and what the president did that was what he usually did. Was all that, were you trying to show the similarities between the two of them by doing that?
Oh, that's very clever, Dean. But I don't think I'm that clever. I don't remember that.
Well, it was just so odd, just on page 5.
How close were they in page? If they were close
they weren't.
to each other, no.
They weren't close.
That could just be me falling into a rut there.
But I was like, why is it important of the as usual? All right, so that was a question I had. Then the focus on the clothing of just, she's on the train and worried about the dress getting wrinkled, and then her focusing on what other people were wearing, and then taking the money and buying the expensive outfit. Was there a theme you're trying to pull through? Well, being so specific in that detail.
That's just period detail that you have to get in, just to give it texture. The Papagallo flats and that sort of stuff. And those are details that she remembered. I didn't have to pull it out of her, because she's a 19-year-old girl then, that's what she's worried about. She's worried about her appearance, and she's worried about, the Madras dress and the ironing and all that. That's where her head was at. Plus the train was muggy and sweaty and hot and all that,
Right.
and I mean, it's not a particularly original way to start a story, on a train, but it's true. And you really didn't have any other way of and once again, so much of the challenges of telling a narrative are getting people from one room to the next. And in this case, we're literally getting her from New Jersey to Washington on a train. And I'm not going to attach any like mythic significance to it, but she's going to another land, and things are going to change really, really fast in the next 4 days, which is kind of an amazing story.
How much did it either help or hurt you to have read the first two drafts by the women who wrote the drafts?
Well, I don't remember Judith's draft, so that was, but she worked, she and I worked together on the proposal, where I could temper her more, wild instincts, I guess. I don't remember that, but what the other writer wrote, she had elicited a lot of facts, we actually did contractually, she had, after we paid her the $125,000, her agent, a tough agent, said, well, she gets a share of the money she's owed had she completed this successfully, in case you use any material that she wrote. So I hired someone to go over the two finished her manuscript versus the one that was accepted that I wrote, and to see how much overlap there was, and attach a word count percentage to it, and then pay her that percentage of what she was owed. And it was only like $60,000 or something. It wasn't much of her left in the final manuscript. Not because of the facts, but mostly because of the tone. It was just all wrong. And you'll notice that really the rhythm of the book is an interesting anecdote, sometimes pretty short, but also some big scenes. And then a lot of interiority, getting inside Mimi's head. And in rereading it, I marvel at how the interiority wasn't that repetitious, didn't really repeat. Certain themes came up, her lack of self-esteem and her concerns and her unhappiness. But each time the situation was different, the president's things, and there was the feelings of inadequacy at Mrs. Porter's as a teen, as a student. And then, early marriage, dissolution of the marriage, divorce, all that stuff, a single woman. They were all different situations. So the interiority changed, but still it was like 1-page anecdote, 2.5 pages inside Mimi's head, and that is what was missing from the rejected manuscript. The other writer did not respect Mimi, so did not want to get into her head, and did not spend the time really pulling out all the soft stuff out of Mimi.
I think it would be, I don't think we can do this, but it would be really interesting to compare and contrast, like the same event from your perspective and from the two failed authors.
I may, if it's worth it, I may be able to dig it up to see how.
It would be really interesting to compare.
Yeah.
So, Mark,
I've been cleaning house here, so I've thrown out a lot of boxes.
Maybe you said this already, but why you didn't take it in the first place? Why you didn't do it in the first place?
It didn't fit my criteria at the
The
time.
three, yeah, of the
That's what they do. Really good at telling a story and doesn't give a shit about money. And so I can get more of it. And no, it was definitely off, but it's the only time I veered off track. But I really enjoyed it. So and it was mostly to save the deal, you know. I got a lot of resistance from Random House on this. They said, "Who is this guy? We're going to have the agent write this book," you know. But they really liked it. So,
Hadn't you written books before that though?
yes, I had. I'd done at least 2 Marshall books. You know, I'd done at least 10 books by then, but the publisher didn't know me that well, I guess. But I think somebody told her, "Well, check out these 2 books," and she kind of calmed down. And one of the greatest days of my life was because this woman in charge of this, the editor, was a late, she's now dead, unfortunately, named Susan Camel, and she's a legend. She is just an amazing editor. And I didn't appreciate this till I appreciated how great an editor she was. But I was driving a car full of women, my wife and 3 women in the back, down to Washington, D.C. to have a friend of ours was getting sworn in as an ambassador in the Obama administration. So we were going to the State Department, and somewhere between, you know, New Jersey and Maryland, in Delaware, the phone rings, and it's this woman, Susan Camel. And the first thing she says is, she'd read the manuscript finally. She goes, "This is amazing." Well, I knew we were going to get paid now. And then she just edited the hell out of it, you know. I mean, it all good. She did, it wasn't like, and she there was just, Mimi and I spent 2 weeks going over her edits and fixing things.
What kind of things did she change?
Well, she would do, you know, little stuff like, because this was a historical story, and there were names in it. And so if you mentioned a name on page, you know, chapter 3 at the White House, and you bring that person back in chapter 9, you have to explain who he is. Well, Susan would always circle that and say, "We know."
Oh,
No, we know. And that's when I really realized was that you don't really have to, the reader retains a lot more than you remember. And they certainly retain when you're repeating yourself. When you're repeating big words, when you overuse a specific word, when you over-explain who the character is, you're insulting the reader. And she would always take those out. And I learned a lot from the experience. You know, there's one tiny scene. This was Mimi saying this. The really critical scene. The president has died. Mimi is that day visiting her future in-laws. She, you know, it's the day she tells about her affair to her fiance. But right before that happens, they're sitting. Some of you are too young to remember the day Kennedy died, but some of us are old enough. Everybody was glued to the television, black and white TV sets, just watching it. And so she's sitting in the den watching TV with her fiance. She's on the floor, and the future in-laws have gone upstairs to bed, but they're such alcoholics that they come down, and one of them pours another drink, and this is the part the editor loved, and says, "Just a splash." You know, it's just such a 60s Connecticut suburban thing to say. And Susan, the editor, circles it and goes, "Nice," with an exclamation. You know, and it's that kind of like novelistic detail, just that tiny detail that a really good editor notes praises if they really like it and never takes it out, never deletes it for whatever reason.
And Mimi remembered that phrase?
Yeah. I remember, and when she told me that, now see, that was not in the previous manuscript,
Mhm.
that sort
Mark.
of, that detail.
Mark, a
I'm
couple
doing
of
on time. I'm seeing Bill getting antsy here.
Oh, actually, I had a thing or two to say. We have
Okay.
3 minutes before the hour, and so we're doing pretty well on time.
Well,
The
my
first
voice
one-
is holding up better than I expected. So
That's great.
if you got more questions.
Yeah, well, the first thing I just noticed that even in telling your story, you started your anecdote with an action. Well, we were driving to DC, and then you started talking about Susan. But I wanted to note one of my favorite sentences and then ask you a question about something else. That beginning of chapter 5, you said it was still early in the evening on the third Thursday of June 1962, a few days before the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, which is such a beautiful bridge because everything has just changed for this young woman, but everything is the same. And then there's this foreshadowing of all that's about to come because it's just before the longest day of the year. It's just so beautiful, Mark.
Thank you. And what made it easy was the Kennedy Library stuff, because I could figure out the day she was up in the residence that night. I guess it was a Wednesday night. Oh, it was a Thursday night. And you could figure it all out. And then you realize that it's, oh my God, it's the longest day of the year, basically. So, and all I was trying to do was figure out, the instigating event was me trying to figure out, well, was it dark or not, And then and you have to research it to get that little detail, But thank you for that. It is good.
So good. And then I noticed you talked a little bit about interiority. And one of the things I had noticed in the early chapters is just how much you used her musings about what the reader might think,
Mhm.
About what she is thinking about herself way in the back. Like, I suppose my first thought should have been to question the propriety, or she thinks about what other people are thinking. And I'd just be interested in your take on how that builds her character, her thinking about so explicitly what we might be thinking as readers.
Well, I think I would say there was a built-in defensiveness to the whole project. That's why that kind of tone creeps in. And I don't know if that was, we were prodded by the publisher about that, but just go as a agent, just thinking in commercial terms, you have to anticipate the reaction to it, which would be, like when she appeared on The View, Whoopi Goldberg walked off before she got on. And Barbara Walters was incredibly rude to her because of the veneration that JFK is still held, in by many, many people and at a certain age. And so we had to anticipate that. So I think tonality wise, there was acknowledging that the reader might look on this. And we were getting a lot of pushback from the first writer, Judith, a lot of pushback about, to Mimi, why won't you say this is rape? So we had to address it from her perspective, saying, I know a lot of people want to use the R word to describe what happened to me, but I don't see it that way, It's my
Why did
story.
Barbara Walters do what she did? I don't get that.
She was just rude to her on The View, basically saying to her, we actually anticipated this in the green room. She's going to come at you because she's very tight with Carolyn Kennedy.
Okay.
And she's going to come at you with questions. Well, don't you care about what the only surviving daughter of the president would think reading this book and that sort of thing? And how could you? And you're doing it for the money and all that, you know?
So those seem like opposite perspectives. Barbara Walters thinking, how could you, make a bad impression this late in the game of JFK, who's such a wonderful person. And then Judith is saying, well, he raped you. Like,
yeah,
you get it from both sides. There's no way to win almost. Yeah.
There was a lot of no-win stuff. You're right. And that's
what was her compelling reason to write the book? What was her compelling reason to tell the story?
The fact that it was taken over by the tabloids, and she was and she said, I want to control my story, you know. I've kept it secret for so long. And basically she was writing it for her grandkids in her mind. And she gave most of the money to them. So she wasn't good for the money.
You talk about, I mean, while in this particular book, yeah, you know, the Kennedy relationship is sort of the quote unquote hook. It's the subtitle of the book. If you were to think about Zinser's quote about only small pieces of a life make an interesting memoir, was there enough in Mimi's life that could have carried this memoir without that, if that event had never happened?
No way. No way. No, I mean, it would have been a self-published memoir.
Interesting question.
Yeah. It mostly, you know, because I don't think she was making it up that this was the governing event of her life in terms of it ruined her first marriage and it begat her second marriage, which is ongoing and very successful, you know. If I could just add just a little thing. So to Amanda's point about Barbara Walters. So we're in the green room before this, anticipating that she's going to come at you. And Barbara Walters had an affair with Senator Brooke of Massachusetts years earlier and wrote about it in her memoir. And so Mimi and I rehearsed. I said, well, maybe if she brings this up, you could say, well, Barbara, that didn't stop you from writing about your affair with Senator Brooke. How do you think his wife felt reading that? And which would take a lot of stones on national TV to pull off with a professional like Barbara. And so it happened, but Mimi decided, she pulled her punches on that. She just let it slide. Greater part of valor and all that. That's just, you know, what you have to deal with the media though. But to Bill's point, there is a built-in defensiveness to it that I don't think is unappealing. You know, I thought it made her more sympathetic, that she's yeah, I know how you're looking at me, you know, that's that sort of thing.
You know, hello, sorry for all the on and off screen. There's chaos behind me. I think the way it's written reflects the tension and the duality that Amanda and others have pointed out, right? Because on the one hand, she comes off like, you know, this Pollyanna-ish character, and it sounds goofy and ridiculous. On the other hand, she says she knew exactly what she was doing, but in 2023, it's just rape. And we have to keep in our heads at, you know, two conflicting ideas, which is that JFK was a rapist, because he just was, but he was also an amazing individual and a great president and did wonderful things for the world. And that's hard for us. And then this whole, like, who am I doing it for? Am I doing it for my kids? You know, and then you sort of think, is she weak because she lived with it for so long, or is she strong because, so I think the way you wrote it, or the way you guys wrote it together, that it reflects all of that, those many, many tensions. And I think that's brilliant. And I thought it was a page turner, and I know the story, and, you know, I just thought it was fantastic. And, you know, you bring into question these characters like Dave and others, like what the hell were they doing? Right. So you're also reflecting the time, you know, like the era, and the drink is part of it. There's so much that's part of it. And I also just wanted to sort of comment, I don't know if it's a question, and I know we're running out of time, but the way you bring in history through the other books, through all those biographies, I thought was fantastic, because I am a data person, right? So I need to know that there's corroborated evidence. And I don't know, I assume you read those books?
Yeah, I
But
read.
was curious.
Yeah, I read a bunch of them. I really liked the Richard Reeves one. That was a good one. I enjoyed that part. Yeah, and the Sorensen book, Counselor. Yeah, they're upstairs somewhere, and probably the only time I read a concentrated reading of history and biography during that year, because that's not what I read generally. Maybe I should, because I really enjoyed it, you know.
How many months and how many weeks how many hours per month did you spend on this?
Well, we were in a bit of a sprint. I think the whole thing, the writing part only took like 4 months. I wrote it pretty fast. And then the waiting for the edits and then working on the edits was another month at least. And then just fine tuning stuff. So I guess it would have been with the research. Now keep in mind, as the agent, I was reading all this thing, and I was, except for that little, when the first writer sent it to Random House without showing it to me, sent some chapters. Maybe 8 months of work, wasn't that much.
And was it full time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, full time. As I recall, I mean, I had clients to represent still at that point in time, but maybe they fired me.
Do you find that you're really efficient with your research? Like you just think, oh, I need this fact. I'll go get that fact. I got it. I'm done, blah, 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 and keep going? Or do you go down rabbit holes and think, why did I just spend 3 hours looking for that?
Everything is it's purposeful.
Okay.
Very, very, very efficient. And I think I attribute a magical gift to myself that I can just turn to the page and find it with the first page I look at. That's not true, but I believe that. It's an article of faith rather than fact. And I am efficient at getting the information. Plus, it's so, there's Wikipedia now, so
Yeah.
check, and then if you want to go into the rabbit hole, but it's kind of I can't say enough about the Kennedy Library information, how much stuff there is there online. Boy, because I never had, I was planning to go to Boston until I discovered the online thing. Thank God, that would have been a week in a library there.
Mhm.
Anyway.
So Mark, this memoir is often described as a short memoir. And there's others that I've read that are always described as long. As the editor or as the writer, what's appropriate? How would you know?
Oh, the length.
Yeah.
Well, it's dictated by the material, but this really is a wisp of a story, as I said. It's really about just one part of her life. You don't know, you've learned very little about, the really painful part of her, 17 or 18-year marriage. No, you don't learn, you don't need to know that much. You only learn everything that's relevant to the once upon a secret theme in there, and a woman searching to be happy. I'm dying here now.
Okay.
Well, I'm better now. If I could just wrap up with just one little thing, just going back to this action thing. We closed the book, and this wasn't my idea. The first writer, Judith, had suggested to Mimi that, and this was good writer instinct. She suggested to Mimi that Mimi and Dick should go down to Arlington to the Kennedy grave just to create a scene, just so the writer could have a scene, right? And so Mimi went and did that in the heart of winter, and the writer never used it, right? And somewhere along the way, Mimi told me about it. Oh, you know, Judith, the writer, had suggested we go down to Arlington. So we did. We took a trip to Washington. And so she described the scene to me. And so that's the way we end the book. And it gives her closure with the president, you know. And there's a little thing there where Mimi's walking away from the grave and she's looking at Kennedy's grave and she says, thank you, you know, whispers thank you to him, because she's now at a perfect moment in her life. You know, she's happy, she's with the man she loves. And, you know, and then we have a nice little karate chop sentence for the last sentence in the book, which is, that's a secret I am happy to let go of and share. Nice, you know? So if the writer had not sent them to Arlington, I wouldn't have a little scene, an anecdote that begins them traveling to Arlington, walking through really cold weather to a grave far down, you know, in the cemetery. Anyway, that.
What would you have used if you hadn't had that?
What? I don't know. Thank God I don't have to worry about it. But I knew. Well, I don't even know if it's the right one, but you look at it, and I spent a lot of time writing those 200 words, a lot of time working on that one, because you got to sum up everything in one and make it real and true what she did. But she gave me all the material, so kind of made it easy. Anyway,
thank you so much. That was really, really interesting, Mark. All of your sessions are really interesting and helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah,
What do you
Mark-
want to do next?
Dean, you always have good ideas what to do next.
I like your memory of that. Again, I don't know if that's factual.
Well, I could you could suggest books you want to read, but they should be not for content again, but they should be for a purpose about an aspect of the craft of writing. And it's possible we haven't even come close to scratching the surface of anecdotes and what to do about them.
Let's stick with that.
Yeah, and why don't I put my thinking cap on and suggest a couple, not really tough reads, but ones that are good, like parallels to this, but not by me, that we could talk more objectively about. And whether they're memoirs or not, I don't know. But let me think about it, and I'll get back to the gang. And if you have thoughts, just
Well,
email.
most of us are not going to write a memoir. Like Evelyn said, we're writing about CEOs having a dilemma or, you know, whatever. So it's actually more useful to think of how we can make a somewhat potentially boring business situation, put people on the edge of their seats and make it very emotive. That would be useful.
Okay, so it's kind of something advicey that packs feeling.
Yeah.
One other idea. Thank you, by the way. I know my picture hasn't been on, but I've been listening the whole time and it's awesome. I would also be interested in a memoir that is not about sleeping with the president, you know, or not about, like, a memoir that you think is really well done, that might even incorporate lessons and things, but a memoir that is actually kind of mundane, but, you know, that doesn't kind of highlight this obvious saleable element, but that becomes a really excellent book.
Okay. The Zinser, it's an old book, and I don't know how memoirs presumably shouldn't date that poorly. Zinser talks a lot about Russell Baker, the old New York Times columnist, his book called Growing Up, which is about growing up in Baltimore, which is a great, great, great memoir. But the problem with he's such a strong stylist that it might challenge it might exceed our abilities to learn from him. He's really good. And it's a very entertaining read, and it's just about growing up in Baltimore. He doesn't get past 18. But I take your point. So the challenge is advicey books that make you feel, or a memoir that has no sex with presidents.
Mark, is there such a thing as a combination of those two? I mean, I'm thinking about Amanda's question about writing about leaders and trying to write about some great thing they did that's a leadership related topic, but is part of building that interest in a story like that about who they are. And
Oh,
so,
it's really good. I hope my son didn't take it. Is a book called Green Lights by Matthew McConaughey.
Oh, yeah.
It's sold about 900 million copies by now. It's been on the bestseller list for 2 years.
I vote yes.
Yeah, that would be a fun read, just because he's got like lists in there and advice and very beautiful and really casual transitions into anecdotes. It would be a fun read, Green Lights.
Maybe we just stick with that since we'll have a month to read it.
Good. I get to
All
read.
right, decision. I've got to run. Thank you very much. Great session. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
thanks, Bill, for organizing things.